Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 18th, 2015, and my guest is author and science writer Matt Ridley. Matt, welcome back to EconTalk.
Russ, it's great to be back on the show again.
We are going to talk about climate change, your view of the current state of our scientific knowledge, and some controversies you've been in. How has your thinking on this issue evolved over time? Give us some background.
Well, I've covered climate change as a journalist for more than 25 years. I first wrote about it in the late 1980s for The Economist. At the time, I took everything that alarmed scientists were saying at face value. I gradually became more skeptical in the 1990s. I then returned to alarmism for a while because of seeing the hockey stick graph, which seemed to me to demonstrate unambiguously that what was happening today was much more drastic, was unprecedented and much more drastic than what we'd seen. So when I discovered that that graph was actually very misleading, once you understood the statistics behind it, I began to look at all the rest of the evidence. And the more I looked, the more skeptical I got, not about the idea that climate changes, not about the idea that mankind can influence the climate, not about the idea that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but about the idea that we are at all likely to see dangerous climate change within the next 100 years or so.
So we're going to come back maybe and talk about the hockey stick, but one issue that hangs over this conversation, and it hangs over our conversations here at EconTalk on economics many times, is this issue of the facts. And I find it remarkable, the deeper you dig into something, the more often you realize that the facts are a little bit ambiguous, uncertain. They're created. They're not just coming down from Sinai. And when people tell me, well, the facts speak for themselves, I always get suspicious because they never do. They have to be prepared and measured and packaged, and that often makes a difference. Now, as you said, you're not skeptical about a lot of things. In fact, you describe yourself as, I love this phrase, a lukewarmer. That's one word. That's not a name. It's not Luke Space Warmer, although that would be an interesting character, I think, if we had a graphic novel about this project. But what do you mean by lukewarmer?
What I mean by lukewarmer is somebody who is not challenging the idea that carbon dioxide levels are increasing, or that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, or that we've seen warming in recent years and are likely to see warming continue, but is challenging the idea that there is a strong likelihood that this will turn dangerous at some point in the future. In fact, I mean, I would often go further and say, actually, there's pretty good evidence that the carbon dioxide emissions we're putting into the atmosphere through fossil fuels are actually in many ways improving the environment. And by that, I mean, we've seen a 14% increase in the amount of green vegetation on the planet in the last 30 years, almost certainly largely because of the extra CO2, which is enabling plants in all ecosystems to grow more vigorously, and that has slightly improved the greenery of the planet, particularly in arid areas like the Sahel and Western Australia. So there are really quite, and I haven't even begun to mention the effect of slightly more rainfall on crops and so on. Drought on the whole has been decreasing over the last 30 years. So there are all sorts of reasons for thinking that for the planet as well as for mankind, carbon dioxide emissions are a good thing. I mean, a far bigger example, of course, is the fact that if we burn coal, oil, and gas, we don't burn wood, and so we don't chop down forests. There is no doubt that switching to fossil fuels enabled us to stop destroying forests on a massive scale, particularly in the Western world, where forests are recovering a lot of land very rapidly. So I think the conversation about climate change is often terribly one-sided, talks only about the damaging impacts and never about the positive impacts of fossil fuels and their emissions. And a lukewarmer like me is someone who thinks that we are unlikely to see dangerous climate change, and we are quite likely to see net benefits. Meanwhile, this doesn't make me someone who's not concerned about the environment. I think there are some very serious environmental challenges. Top of my list is invasive species, which are helping to decimate native species, particularly on islands all over the world still. And this has been a big problem for hundreds of years, and it's getting worse at the moment. And I think those issues are being neglected because we're spending all our time talking about climate change.
So when you suggest that it might actually be good for humanity or the world to have more CO2, that must drive some people very crazy. And we will talk about the kind of reactions you've been getting over the last few years to your writing and positions. Why do you think to focus on the key part, I think, of the lukewarmer position, why do you think that there's little or no risk of dangerous climate change? So there might be, we've had, I think, 0.8 of a degree of centigrade warming over the last, I forget how long. The worry is we might go to 4 or 6. Why aren't you worried about that? True, it might be, the dose makes the poison. Maybe a little bit of more CO2 is better for human life and the planet. But when we get into the range of the higher increases that some people are worried about, those would seem to be pretty dangerous.
Yes. Well, 2 reasons. One is because the rate of warming has been much slower than predicted. So if you go back and look at what the IPCC's climate models have predicted, we have seen much less warming over the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years than those models have predicted. We've seen a little more than 0.1 degree per decade. The IPCC, remember, in 2013 came out and said that it is very confident that more than half of the warming since 1950 is man-made. Now, we've had 0.8 of a degree since 1880, about 0.5 of a degree since 1950. More than half of that is 0.25 of a degree. So they're saying that something like 1/3 of a degree of warming is man-made over 50 years. Now, that's extremely hard to measure, and we've got no really good evidence that we're measuring it accurately. In fact, the surface temperatures tend to find a slightly faster rate than the satellites, which implies that we are contaminating the record with urban heat island effects and things like that. Local warming, in other words, not global warming. So that's the first reason, is that we've got nothing in the data we've seen so far to suggest that increasing carbon dioxide from 0.03% of the atmosphere to 0.04%, which is what we've done, has produced anything like the speed of warming that we would expect if the models were right. The second reason is that the models are assuming something which we now know pretty well not to be true. And that is that the carbon dioxide warming will be hugely amplified by a water vapor warming. It's a very little known fact, which is often sort of kept out of the conversation to my frustration, that it's widely agreed by the IPCC and everybody else that if you double carbon dioxide, you only get 1 degree of warming. 1.2, 1.1, that sort of zone of warming.
If you double the stock, the amount. If
you double the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Not double emissions, but double the level in the atmosphere from 300 parts per million to 600 parts per million, or 400 to 800. It doesn't matter where you double from because the graph is curved. If you double from 800 to 1600, you would still expect to get 1 degree of warming. That's the way the arithmetic works. So why do they say that their estimate of climate sensitivity, which is the amount of warming from a doubling, is 3 degrees? Not 1 degree. And the answer is because the models have an amplifying factor in there. They are saying that that small amount of warming will trigger a further warming through the effect mainly of water vapor and clouds. In other words, if you warm up the Earth by 1 degree, you will get more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas, and that will cause you to treble the amount of warming you're getting. Now, that's the bit that lukewarmers like me challenge, because we say, look at the evidence. We're not seeing the increases in water vapor in the right parts of the atmosphere. You have to know which parts of the atmosphere you're looking at. to justify that, and nor are you seeing the changes in cloud cover that justify these positive feedback assumptions. Some clouds amplify warming, some clouds do the opposite. They would actually dampen warming. And most of the evidence we're seeing to date suggests that clouds are actually having a damping effect on warming. So, we're getting a little bit of warming as a result of carbon dioxide. The clouds are making sure that warming isn't very fast, and they're certainly not exaggerating or amplifying it. So there's very, very weak science to support that assumption of a trebling. Now, the really interesting thing is that when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with its latest report on this, the main report was in 2013, the follow-up report was last year in 2014, they had before them 14 different peer-reviewed papers of this climate sensitivity issue, all of which pointed to a much lower climate sensitivity than they had been assuming in the past. And these were the ones based on observational data. And rather than adjust what they did, they adjusted the range of climate sensitivity they think is likely downwards slightly from the previous year, from the previous report in 2007. But they did not give a best estimate of climate sensitivity, which had been 3 degrees in 2007. They simply didn't give one. They simply said, we don't know what the best estimate is. Now, that's been completely ignored in all the impact models that countries are using around the world to estimate how much warming they're going to get and what the effect will be on people's livelihoods and sea level and so on. They've gone on assuming that the best estimate is 3 degrees, whereas pretty well every scientist who's working on this is now accepting that climate sensitivity is more in the 1 to 2 degree range. So, and that, by the way, explains in an instant the rate of warming we've had over the last 50 years. If it's only in the 1 to 2 degree range climate sensitivity, then that would explain why we've only had 1/3 to 1/2 degree of warming in 50 years when we should have had much more than that. So if you see what I mean, both the theory and the data support lukewarming and not alarming warming. Why is everyone going on about the future being alarming? Because there's a huge vested interest in that now.
So we had Martin Weitzman on recently, who with Gernot Wagner is the author of Climate Shock, and Weitzman takes what he calls a precautionary approach or a fat tail approach. He says, true, it's not so likely that we're going to have catastrophic warming, but since there is a chance, a prudent approach is to take precautions and to reduce the possibility of that catastrophic outcome. In fact, the level that he's worried about is the 700 parts per million. I think we're around 400 right now. Do I have that right? High 300s? Yep. So the worry is
0.04% or 0.07% is, I think, a more accurate way of describing it, but it doesn't sound so big, so they like to call it 400.
Yeah, well, it's parts per million. So it's a small number, but that's that's life. So his worry is that in the next 100 years, which is a long time, but it's a short time when lifespans are expanding and we have direct worries about our children and grandchildren, over the next 100 years we could hit 700. 700 could. He suggests I think he suggests there's a 10% chance that could lead to 6 degrees of warming. You're suggesting that's just not possible given the relationship between carbon dioxide concentration and temperatures that we've observed in the past. Now, the question would be, so one, I want you to verify that I've got that right. And then two, the question would be, it is possible that there are other things going on, that the reason we've only seen the small amounts of warming we have so far is because of sunspot activity, volcanic activity, ocean changes, who knows? What do we know about any of that?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. There are huge uncertainties. We don't know about all of that. And one of the frustrations has been these recent papers saying things like, well, the warming's gone into the ocean. And then instead of that being a sort of guess, a hypothesis, a really preliminary discovery, it becomes they've solved the problem, and therefore, et cetera. It becomes there's premature consensus, premature certainty being declared the whole time in this debate, which is very dangerous. But back to the main point about Martin Weitzman's fat tails. You described his point very accurately, and it is a well-known argument that a small possibility of a very large disaster needs to be taken seriously. It's, in a sense, the same idea as the black swan argument that Nassim Taleb said.
Yeah,
I would argue that it's actually... Sorry?
Taleb has made the same point about climate change. He is
yes, indeed.
He's in the same camp.
Yeah. And I would argue that it's actually a new version of Pascal's wager. If you remember, Blaise Pascal said, I don't think God exists, but if he does, I'm in much deeper trouble for not believing in him. Whereas if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. Therefore, it pays to believe in him, if you see what I mean. It's a sort of the same sort of argument.
Yep.
Rather than take a chance.
Eternal damnation is a big negative, so a few years of religious observance is a good investment. That's the argument.
Exactly. And I think that's a slightly closer analogy than other people would think. In other words, I think there's an element of sort of religiousness in all this. But why do I think that Weitzman's approach in that respect is not the right way to think about it? Two reasons. One is empirical, that actually the fat tail on the distribution, the relatively significant, even if small, possibility of a really big warming has got a heck of a lot thinner in recent years. This is partly because there was a howling mistake in the 2007 IPCC report, the AR4 report, where a graph was actually distorted, and a brilliant scientist named Nick Lewis pointed this out later. And it's one of the great shocking scandals, actually, of this, is that a graph, and I'm literally talking about the shape of the tail of a graph, was distorted to make a fatter tail than was necessary. When you correct that, the number gets smaller. When you feed in all these 14 papers that I've been talking about, all the latest observational data, 42 scientists involved in publishing this stuff, most of the mainstream scientists, I'm not talking about skeptics here, when you feed all that in and you get the average probability density functions for climate sensitivity, they turn out to have much thinner tails than was portrayed in the 2007 report and that Martin Weitzman is basing his argument on. So the 10% chance of 6 degrees of warming in 100 years becomes much less than 1% if you look at these charts now. So we've got to update our knowledge based on our latest information. And after all, we've got, 5 more years of data and 5 more years of relatively slow warming, etc., and 5 more years of knowledge about what in the past. And by the way, one of the excuses for the lack of warming of the last 50 years has since been exploded, and that is the aerosol one. It used to be thought that we were dampening warming by putting so much sulfate into the atmosphere through the burning of coal, that there is an effect there, but it turns out that now we know more about it, that effect is smaller than we thought. So for all these reasons, the tail is very thin. The probability of really dramatic warming is extremely small indeed now, has been narrowed down, and that is acknowledged in the last IPCC report, not explicitly enough for my liking, but it is there. And it's got to the point where it's so thin that, in my view, it deserves no more attention than the small possibility that we will be hit by an asteroid, the small possibility that there will be a catastrophic volcanic explosion, the small possibility that the measures we're taking against climate change, including renewable energy and preventing people getting hold of fossil fuels and things like that, will itself be very dangerous. All these things could be dangerous. Aliens could arrive and take over the planet. Should we spend a lot of money now to try and prevent that possibility? You have to, at some point, take a reasonable view that certain possibilities are too small to spend a fortune on.
Well, some would argue if that aliens attacked the planet, it would stimulate the economy as we prepared for it, but I will leave that to another episode. I want to mention 2 more factual issues, and then I want to turn to the social issue of how these how the climate science issue is getting discussed and the polarization of it that you've written about recently. The first factual issue I want to mention is when I sometimes suggest that I'm somewhat skeptical of our understanding of the relationship between human activity and the climate, I often am greeted with the clever response, well, 97% of scientists disagree with you, and you're only an economist, so how can you hold that view given that there's this massive consensus that 97% of scientists are convinced? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm in the 97%. That is to say, if it's true that 97% of scientists are of a particular view about climate, then let's go and ask what that view is. And if you go and look at the origin of that figure, it was that a certain poll of 79 scientists, by the way, an extraordinarily small sample, said that 97% of them agreed that human beings had influenced climate and that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas. Well, I'm in that group. Pretty well every skeptic I know is in that group. I'm amazed they found 3% to disagree with that, so, if you see what I mean. So actually, whenever you hear that 97% number, it's not referring to a consensus about dangerous climate change. It's referring to a consensus about humans' ability to affect the climate. And that covers everything from a tiny effect to a big effect. Now, there was a subsequent paper which claimed that 97% of papers published in this area supported climate change. But again, it was just about supporting man-made climate change. It wasn't about supporting dangerous climate change. So when President Obama tweeted that 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is man-made and dangerous, the first word was right, the second word was wrong. It's just not true. I mean, I'm afraid he was just telling a lie or misinformed about that. There has never been any study which has shown that 97% of scientists think climate change, man-made climate change, is dangerous. By the way, there was a much bigger survey of members of the American Meteorological Association, most of whom are scientists and all of whom are climatologists in some sense. And the figure there, when asked about how many of you think that climate change is likely to be dangerous, the figure there was 52%.
Well, they still win. I'm laughing because I really resent, and this happens in economics as well, I really resent the implication that science is a majority rule process.
Well, absolutely.
It's vulgar. It's vulgar.
That was yeah. And of course, the whole point of science is that as Richard Feynman famously said, science is in the business of proving that experts are wrong. Until very recently, 97% of medics agreed that cholesterol was a cause of heart disease. Now, that's gone. That theory's wrong. Pretty well everybody, well, not pretty well everybody, but gradually most people are realizing that just ain't true. Dietary cholesterol, I should say. Cholesterol is involved in heart disease, but it's not because you're eating it in your diet. And that was based on very dodgy science in the 1950s, which was enforced by a pretty ruthless consensus-building exercise that was pretty brutal to people who disagreed with it.
Well, it's a fascinating...
And we've seen this again and again in science.
Yeah, well, it's in economics, as I said, as well, and I find it very frustrating. It's obviously the case that at any point in time there can be disagreement about, say, cholesterol, about the causes of ulcers. It takes a while. It's not like everybody immediately sees the data and immediately changes their mind, but eventually controversial theories get either accepted or rejected, and new things have to come along to change that. In economics, and I'm afraid in climate change, what they have in common, of course, is that they're multi-causal, complex phenomena using time series data frequently. It's very hard to measure these things with precision. And but the other thing that I think that I want to emphasize here and I want to turn to is this question of where the data come from. Let's talk about the hockey stick, why the reaction to the hockey stick and the reaction to the reaction, and why what its impact on you was.
Yes, the hockey stick is a chart of temperatures over basically the last 1,000 years, produced in the late 1990s and based on so-called proxies. Now that means that you obviously can't go back and look up the temperature in Arizona in 1420 because no one was walking around with a thermometer there. But what you can do is look at the width of tree rings. And if you make the assumption that trees are growing faster in warmer temperatures, then you can say it was warmer then or it was colder then, and you can produce a chart. And if you combine lots of these proxies, you come up with a rough estimate of temperature over the last 1,000 years. And what it appeared to show was a sort of gentle cooling for most of that time, followed by a very rapid warming in the last 50 or 100 years.
Corresponding to the onset of modernity, modern economic growth, and human activity. Exactly.
Now, it turned out that there were two things badly wrong with it. One was that many of the data sets, the most dominant data set of all, was from bristlecone pine trees in the American West, which had been explicitly gathered by scientists who knew they were measuring a different phenomenon, namely the fact that overgrazing in that area had caused tree bark wounds, which resulted in rather rapid growth as the tree tried to cover up the wounds, if you like. It's called strip bark. But anyway, the point was nobody who was actually measuring the tree rings of bristlecone pine trees thought that bristlecone pine tree ring width reflected temperature. So that data set shouldn't have been used. The second problem, and I'm simplifying a bit here, there's a lot of other details and a lot of other data sets to discuss, but the second problem, if you like, was that the statistical filter through which the data was passed, called short-centering, resulted in any data series which showed a 20th century uptick being vastly exaggerated, being able to influence the final outcome more than 100 times. In other words, the statistical method was, and this was beautifully demonstrated by Ross McKittrick and Steve McIntyre, a Canadian economist and mathematician, basically, who were incredibly diligent in tracking this down. And they showed that actually this method was fishing out any data with a hockey stick shape and giving it undue emphasis. So what happens if you leave the bristlecone pines out and one other set of data from the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada? And the answer is, if you do that, the hockey stick disappears altogether. Now, this was known to the scientists doing the work because they'd actually done that. And they accidentally revealed this when they sent a data file called Censored into the public domain, which showed that they had discovered that without those two data sets, they couldn't get a hockey stick. Now, you don't have to get lost in the details of this or start accusing people of malfeasance, which I'm not doing here. I'm just saying that this one incredibly influential graph, and it was influential not only on me but on the world. It was used 6 times in the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was displayed at the press conference when the report was announced. It was a fantastically important chart. This chart was based on data which you've only got to take one data set out, and the chart changes shape completely. Now, for me, that's a real alarm bell. That tells you that you're potentially contaminating your conclusions with very, very suspect data. There was then there were further attempts to sort of rescue the hockey stick, which involved larch trees from Siberia. And again, when you drilled down, it turned out that there was one incredibly influential larch tree in the sample. One tree.
A single tree.
Yeah.
Well, it could be very. Now it could be very informative. It is, but of course, it could be that distinctive things happened in that neighborhood that had nothing to do with the world as a whole. That's the problem.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, if you've got a larch tree growing in the shade and all the other larch trees suddenly fall down because of a storm and it's left alone in the sun, it'll suddenly grow faster. That might have been what happened in the 20th century to that particular larch tree.
So this comes back to a point that Ed Leamer makes in his theme of taking the con out of econometrics, which is sensitivity analysis, that when you present something, although it's more dramatic and gets you more attention when you just present one end of it, it's a good idea to describe how sensitive your results are to assumptions you make, to other sizes of other variables and what their size might be, et cetera. But what I found interesting about, and I don't know anything about the large trees of Siberia, so I can't comment other than to agree that one tree seems unreliable, what we might call a thin reed to lean on, is the reaction when that was pointed out. And I think this whole, I would call it the sociology of science, the way this conversation moves forward is what's so depressing to me. And I think obviously to you as you've written about it, and I want to turn to that. So talk about how people reacted to that discovery and some of the other reactions that you've received when you've come out and suggested that maybe it's not as bad as it seems.
Yes, well, the person who's probably written most eloquently about this is Professor Judith Curry, who's a proper climate scientist, unlike me, and
previous EconTalk guest. So yeah,
right. Okay. Yes, and she talks about. She's fascinating about the reaction of her colleagues when she started having doubts about some of the, having been herself signed up to the mainstream view on this, and she started having doubts and challenging it and doing what she thought a scientist should do. And what we were kind of all trained, those of us who did PhDs in science, I was in zoology, but you got gold stars in the class by saying during the seminar to the distinguished professor who was presenting his results in front of you, but have you thought about testing it this way? Are you sure that this effect isn't caused by something else? Or maybe you're muddling cause and effect here, things like that, etc. You were actually supposed to challenge. And when she started doing that and other people started doing that, instead of being allowed to have a conversation, it became, you've joined the dark side, you're a heretic, you're funded by the fossil fuels, you're a denier, which is an extraordinary phrase that began to be used for anybody who didn't sign up to alarmism and was deliberately intended to echo the Holocaust denial nonsense. So it became very much the psychology of taboo in a phrase that's quite often used. That it was taboo to question this, that if you thought that the hockey stick wasn't a reliable piece of data, then you were somehow sinning against the orthodoxy, and you were being unhelpful because the world needed urgent action on climate change, and this continues to become more and more powerful a meme. And what you find now is that, for example, in my profession, in journalism, very few people now ask the sort of skeptical questions about climate science that they do about economic policy, political policy, foreign policy, etc. They don't subject it to the same sort of scrutiny because they've been kind of frightened off by this. How dare you not join in this bandwagon?
It's a fascinating thing because it goes against the culture of the profession, as you point out, and yet in this corner, it's I think it has an effect.
Well, I've actually changed my mind a little on this. I used to think this was an exception, that science is actually, the whole point of science is challenge and so on. And I can see why in climate science this has happened, and that's because the IPCC process has sort of made a single church out of it, whereas science is often a very geographically distributed enterprise with people in different universities all over the country and all over the world challenging each other, which is actually quite helpful. The fact that there are rival groups prepared to say Professor Jones has got this wrong is what has made science, what has kept science honest all these years. But actually, if you look back at other episodes in science, there is a surprisingly strong tendency for this to happen. And I refer again to cholesterol, I refer to Lysenkoism. Well, that was in a totalitarian regime where one biologist was able to, Trofim Lysenko was able to insist on his version of genetics, and even got some of his opponents imprisoned. But, even things like continental drift and the age of the Earth, it's often been very hard. Or you mentioned stomach ulcers. The two Australians who 20 years ago said, I don't think stomach ulcers are caused by what we think they are. We think they're caused by a bacterium, which is easily cured by antibiotics. They were hounded and ridiculed and vilified for this absurd heresy until they ended up with the Nobel Prize, and we now recognize they were 100% right and the others were wrong. But it's not at all unusual for science to do this, to start championing one cause and making one church out of things. And by the way, there's an element of confirmation bias here, and confirmation bias is an important aspect of what happens. In other words, if I come up with a theory, then I'm not going to go out and look for ways in which this theory is wrong. I'm going to go out and look for ways in which this theory is right. And that's what we all do. We all act like the prosecuting attorney who's trying to prove his case, rather than being that. And scientists will often claim we're the only profession that challenges our own ideas. It's not really true, actually. Most of them actually look for confirmatory evidence. And by the way, I don't think we should stop them. I don't think it's possible to expect, Professor Jones at such universities come up with a new idea to suddenly be his own worst enemy. It's just unrealistic, that. But what I do think we should expect is that Professor Smith should be Professor Jones's worst enemy. That's what's kept science honest over the years.
That's right. And I've been writing recently about how hard it is for economists to change each other's minds with data, and that suggests that maybe economics is not so scientific. But the fact is that
I think it's a very similar situation.
Right.
I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I'm thinking about Semmelweis and puerperal fever when women were dying in childbirth.
Absolutely.
Semmelweis went out and he did a couple of quick, small experiments that confirmed his theory, which was people needed to wash their hands when they left the morgue before they went to deliver babies in the maternity ward. And he was laughed at. And it wasn't open and shut to the other people. In fact, what was the opposite? His theories were obviously kooky and crazy.
Worse than laughed at. He was driven out.
Correct.
He was, and he went mad in the end and all that.
So, speaking of going mad, you've been harassed quite a bit lately on a personal. By the way, the other part about this that's frustrating is that you don't expect academics and scientists or social scientists, in the case of economics, to be name callers. And I don't know whether this is it's tempting to say this is a modern phenomenon. I suspect it's not. I have a feeling that scientists in the 18th century and 19th century probably had ad hominem attacks on their opponents as well. But
yes, I think that's true, actually. Yeah.
It's a strange thing, though, that when you put an idea forward that you're called a bad name rather than having a patient explanation of why you're wrong. And I think my view is the angrier and ruder my opponents get, that suggests that I'm doing okay, because if it weren't getting it under their skin, they could just say, well, he's wrong and here's why, and it'd be black and white and open and shut. And it's not, and that's part of the problem. But you've been under some attacks lately. So what has happened, and what's that been like?
Yes, well, just to illustrate your point, there's an old saying, when you're taking flak, you're over the target zone.
There you go.
But I took a lot of personal attacks. People attack my motives, and it's true that I have got personal investments in coal mining near my home. In fact, my family's been in it one way or another for a couple of 100 years. So maybe I have a vested interest in carbon dioxide emissions. But I've always declared that. I've always made that very explicit. So
you owned that coal when you were worried about global warming.
Well, exactly.
Right.
That's right. In fact,
it kind of gives you
to some extent, it's held me back. I've sort of thought, well, I better not. I must be being influenced by my own vested interests here, so I'd better be careful. So for a long time, I hesitated before expressing my skepticism for that reason. But anyway, I was attacked for that. But extraordinary attacks. I mean, really bizarre attacks would come at me. Very personal, very rude, often of the nature of this strange sort of fact-checking which doesn't check facts, which says his article is full of errors, and then doesn't actually give any example of anything that's errors. They might say he said X, but he didn't say Y. Well, that's not an error. It's an omission, but it's not an error, or something like that. So often it got nastier and nastier the more I put my head above the parapet on this. And eventually I wrote an article for the Times in London saying, why is it my views on this are pretty mild, actually. I'm a lukewarmer, I'm not a skeptic. Why are the attacks so nasty? Why do some of my colleagues in the House of Lords resort to impugning the quality of my PhD thesis, which was on the behavior of birds 35 years ago?
I found that very entertaining, actually. After you wrote about that, I followed up and I looked into it. That's amazing.
But having, by the way, I'm sure there were mistakes in my thesis, but the very man who impugned me had been my thesis examiner and said it's a very good thesis in the end.
That's awkward. That's very awkward.
Anyway, I really wrote this up as a sort of entertaining story. Just, this is what happens if you step into this arena. You get a lot of mud thrown at you, and it wasn't. I really wasn't. I was really trying to be quite lighthearted and say that this happens and it's the way the world is. I wasn't trying to play the victim card or anything like that. Anyway, the reaction to this article was another of these pieces in The Guardian, dissecting my article and showing what an evil person I was to have written even this article. And the illustration at the head of this article was of the severed head of a zombie. And the implication was that I was a sort of zombie person whose views were so old-fashioned and so dead that they needed to be cut out. And the article virtually said as much. And then below the article, somebody wrote a comment saying, shouldn't that be Matt Ridley's head in the picture? And somebody else said, isn't that going a bit far? And he said, no, I think we should do this kind of thing. This was the day that a Japanese hostage was beheaded in Syria. And then somebody else put a comment saying, the man who's just made these two comments about Matt Ridley being beheaded is actually, although he's using a pseudonym, a chap called Gary Evans, who occasionally writes for The Guardian. He shouldn't be doing this. This is not just an ordinary internet troll. That comment was then removed by the editors, but not the comments recommending that I be beheaded. At which point someone drew this to my attention, and I wrote a letter to the editor of The Guardian saying, excuse me, this is technically hate speech and death threats. I'm not going to give it to the police, but I really do think you ought to do something about that. And at that point, they did intervene and remove these threats, but it took them 3 weeks to apologize for this. Now, I'm not claiming that my safety was genuinely threatened here, but I am claiming that goes too far. That, come on. All I'm saying is that I think we may be spending too much money enriching wind farm tycoons and too little money reducing poverty with fossil fuels at the moment, because I don't think climate change is going to be as dangerous in 100 years' time as you think. I might be wrong in that. I might feel guilty for having had that view in 50 years' time as the Earth heats up rapidly. But I don't think it's illegitimate for me to make that argument, and I certainly don't think it requires threats to cut my head off.
I'm on the same page there. I want to say, though, I want to digress here for a moment, and I want to mention that I get suggestions from time to time to have on this program people running for president or current politicians, and I always respond by saying I don't believe in having politicians on EconTalk because they're not truth seekers. They're generally not educators and interested in finding the truth. They have a message to deliver, and that's what they do, and nothing wrong with that, but that's just not what we do here. So I should say, Matt, that you are an exception to this policy. In some dimension, you're an office holder. You are not an American, you're not a member of the American political system, but you are in the House of Lords. And I have to also add that the dialogue that you linked to in a recent article, we'll put a link up to it as well, where you were arguing with some fellow members of Parliament, it's just unbelievable. It's just, first of all, the quality is very high, which is a tribute to the British educational system or the British people. I don't know what it is. The idea that American members of Congress could argue with such eloquence on either side would be absurd. But you are a politician in some dimension, so I just want to get that. We have to be honest about that.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let me just pick you up on one word, though. Office holder is wrong. I'm a backbench Conservative member of the House of Lords, which means I'm one of 800 people who are in a position where they can take part in debates on and votes on legislation in the upper house of Parliament, which is, by the way, the far less powerful house, the house that always gives way on legislation. It's not as powerful as the Senate or the House of Representatives in our system. So in that sense, I am a very, very low form of life politically. But you're absolutely right. I am a politician in that sense. But I'm not a politician in the sense of being on message or representing a view of the government. In fact, judging by the exchange I had yesterday with government minister in the House of Lords, I'm probably not flavour of the month with my own government at the moment, but that's another matter. Yes, you're right. I found myself with this opportunity to express my views both in the political arena and through my journalism. But debates in the House of Lords are often just about expressing views rather than insisting on policies, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
I am trying to influence policy, but
the other thing I want to clarify, your position in the House of Lords, are you up for election in any time soon?
Yes, well, that's a very good point. I'm not running for re-election ever again, because in theory I'm appointed for life now.
How does that work?
Well, everybody in the House of Lords is appointed for life. They literally can stay there till they fall apart. People increasingly retire rather than fall apart, but there we go. I'm not. Nearly all members of the House of Lords are appointed by either the governing party or by a different mechanism. I'm actually in an unusual group of people who hold hereditary titles, like the ones that the barons at Magna Carta had. And a small percentage of whom are still allowed to sit in the House of Lords, and they select among themselves who that group is. So if you like, there's an electoral college of hereditary peers who elect a small number to be in the House of Lords. I'm one of those. And the reason I'm a hereditary peer is because 4 generations ago, one of my ancestors was a senior member of Parliament, elected member of Parliament, and was given a peerage by Queen Victoria in 1900. So I'm nothing like an ancient baron from Magna Carta time, but I have got one of these titles, which enables me to stand for a sort of election, but a very small election, to the House of Lords. I'm sorry about that digression into Britain's bizarre constitution.
Given that we recently... Go ahead.
Now, my position may not last. I'm a group which is often thought to be an anomaly in the current constitution.
Kind of a dinosaur, right? I mean, it's kind of perfect for a climate, for a lukewarmer. I think you're really holding an appropriate position in the government. We recently had an episode on the Magna Carta here at EconTalk, and I want to say there's no limit to what you can learn by listening to this program, and that we've just had another example of that. So for those of you who weren't quite clear on the House of Lords, we've I hope made you wiser. So that's good.
I've only scratched the surface of the complicated system.
I know.
But the way to think of the House of Lords is a gigantic think tank where we talk about things, I think.
Well, as I said, the quality is very high. Now let's. I'm going to put you in an uncomfortable position. You resent, as do I, when your opponents presume that you're not a nice person, that you must be the pawn of special interests. And yet we also should judge our intellectual opponents the way we'd like to be judged. So given how you are in a minority viewpoint, Can you give us an interpretation of the people on the other side that is more charitable? You've suggested they're at the trough. They are making a lot of money off of this through research grants and government spending. Surely some of them are well-intentioned people genuinely worried about the state of the world. Can you give them their due, and what would they say? What would some of those folks say listening to your lack of concern?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's a vital corrective. And I always try to do what you say and not make ad hominem arguments or question people's motives. I don't always succeed, I must admit, but I like to think I'm generally responding rather than initiating these sort of exchanges. Yes, I think there are a lot of people who have. I mean, there are some people who know perfectly well that I'm right and are nonetheless determined because they're on the bandwagon to keep going. Of course, there's going to be some like that. But I think the vast majority of people have not read deeply into climate science. And I've read quite deeply, but I won't claim that I read deeply enough, or as much as other people. But the vast majority of people who have a strong view on this, whether it's in environmental organizations, in politics, or in journalism, or even in everyday life, have only scratched the surface, and have somehow equated in their mind the fact that climate has changed with a threat, with the fact that it's dangerous. And it's that illusion, elision between. So when somebody, so people will often say to me, "Oh, come on, you've got to admit the birds have arrived earlier this spring. Therefore, we face a dangerous future."
The icebergs are melting.
That therefore is a gigantic leap. So I don't think that those kind of people are being intellectually dishonest at all. I just think they've failed to appreciate that there's a difference between climate changing and climate changing dangerously. I therefore feel that there's a chance to have a reasonable conversation with such people. Now, of course, there are others who know even more than me and who still remain alarmed. And that's not necessarily because they're corrupt in some way. It's because we all look at the evidence and see what we want to see to some extent. And no doubt I'm doing the same. I mean, when I see a piece of evidence saying we reckon now that there was no pause in global warming over the last 15 to 18 years, because if you look at the way sea surface temperatures were measured, once they started using intakes of water into ships rather than buckets thrown over the sides of the ships, they introduced a distortion that appeared to lead to a cooling of the temperatures when in fact it didn't. I look at that and think, oh, come on, you're trying really hard to find an excuse. Whereas they look at that and think, ha-ha, see, you guys were wrong. Now, take another piece of data and I might take their view and they might take our view. So we're back to confirmation bias, that if you look hard enough, you can find lots of evidence to be alarmed about global warming while being intellectually honest. And if you look hard enough, you can find lots of evidence not to be alarmed while being intellectually honest. But if it was a 50-50 fight where we were each allowed to have that view, fine. It's like thinking that social justice is more important than wealth creation, or vice versa. I.e. left versus right in politics.
They're not scientific questions.
It's not a scientific question.
Yeah. That's alarming. That makes people uncomfortable, but I think that's unfortunately where we are with many issues. I don't know if that's where we are with climate change. I just want to make a personal note that I've always been – I would call myself agnostic or skeptical about the climate change debate, partly for the reasons you mentioned, that a lot of the so-called cures strike me as very dangerous, raising the price of energy when a large portion of the world's very poor strikes me as a cruel thing to do. And so the uncertainty and the failure to predict accurately is always suggested to me that scientists don't fully understand this, even though, as you point out, I'm certainly very ignorant. You're talking about yourself. I'm very ignorant of the details. I've not read deeply, but I have a certain intuition from my knowledge of economics and how research is done. And when I see people repeatedly overestimating the impact of carbon dioxide, I start to think, why aren't they starting to get more humble about their approach? They don't. They seem to get more certain, and that causes me to be skeptical. Then I have somebody like Nassim Taleb, who I've learned a lot from, who's very alarmed about it. I have Martin Weitzman, who was very humble and very willing to admit that we don't know that much about it. So I start to think, well, maybe we should be more prudent. Maybe we should be more cautious. Mm-hmm. Then Matt Ridley, who's a fine fellow, and even though he doesn't,
very nice.
Well, he doesn't like the Tottenham Hotspurs like I do, but he's a fine fellow. And I gave a talk in London that he came to it, and I thought, well, what a decent chap. And,
it was a really, really good talk.
That's kind of you, but as a result, I find myself, I can go back to my old view now because Matt's so I'm being honest here. And I'm kind of exaggerating for dramatic effect, but I think it's fascinating to me how, as you point out, people who have little or no expertise in this area have an immense amount of confidence. And it's based on trust, respect for authority, and a lack of skepticism that and there's a confirmation bias. You become identified with a certain position. It becomes awkward, socially embarrassing to concede that you maybe were wrong. I just find it fascinating how hard it is to get at the truth in an area that has become as politicized as this one has.
I completely agree with that. And by the way, you said one thing there which I think is important, and that is that none of this would matter if the measures we were taking were costless. But one of the reasons why Martin Weitzman's view to me is not attractive is because he's saying, look, we've got to do something just in case there's damage to our great-grandchildren. Well, I'm saying, yeah, but to damage poor people today because you're worried about the fate of your great-grandchildren doesn't seem to me to be altruistic. Quite the reverse. It feels selfish to me. And I think none of this would matter if we weren't taking measures in terms of energy policy, in terms of biofuels, in terms of denying electricity to the people who really need it in the third world, affordable electricity, I should say. Those are genuine costs. Nobody denies that we're costing ourselves and humanity something with the measures we're taking. I think we're taking chemotherapy for a cold.
Well, I think the right response to this mix of alarm versus maybe it's not so bad, and this mix of an uncertain catastrophe in the future and a certain catastrophe today because of the measures you're taking, I think the right response to that is to favor policies that mitigate the worst of the effects we're talking about. So if we are to do something about climate change, putting on a tax on carbon while lowering an income tax, not that that's ever going to happen politically, seems like an attractive way to do something. Putting a tax on reducing usage in developed countries that are rich relative to countries that are desperately trying to get out of poverty that's killing people seems like a good idea. And that's also politically a dead end. So that leads us, I think, to what those two being political dead ends leads me to where I think we will ultimately go, which is to adaptation. We will cope with the climate that changes, and that will mean maybe a little more air conditioning, which will be ideally we'll be wealthier because we didn't pursue some of these costly policies that have been advocated for. Would you recommend doing anything, and would you rely on adaptation?
Yeah, no, well, I agree with you that adaptation is important, and in fact, the IPCC in its latest report says this. It has a report recommending huge amounts of adaptation, much more than it's ever recommended before. This, for some reason, is always ignored by people who are talking about this these days, but it's a very important part of what they're recommending, and they're dead right. But the other thing I would do, as well as adaptation, is research. In other words, as people like Bjorn Lomborg have argued, instead of rolling out inefficient, highly expensive 14th century technologies like wind, in a vain attempt to cut carbon emissions, which is signally failing to do on any significant scale, why don't we research energy really intensively. So at the moment we're putting about 100 times as much money into subsidizing the production of energy from renewables as we are into R&D in renewables and nuclear. And that's where let's get fusion, let's get thorium, let's get molten salt reactors, let's get all these ideas for zero carbon energy properly and fundamentally researched, because one of them is going to provide us with an answer that will blow fossil fuels out the water and impoverish people like me, and good for them. But let's do that rather than subsidize crummy old technologies that are making terribly little difference and are chopping up eagles and ruining landscapes and all the other things that wind power does. Sorry, you've got me onto a hobby horse here.
And you've said you could make some money on wind, personally.
Yes, I'm a landowner in the north of England. I get letters through the post from not only wind developers but solar developers offering mouth-watering sums of money if I would let them build on my land. But those sums of money would come from the energy bills of people. That's the way we do it in this country. We add a stealth tax onto energy bills. They're pure public subsidies, tax subsidies, but they're not called taxes. They're just additions to the bills of people. Now, energy bills are a more important part of the budget for poor people than they are for rich people. So this is a regressive tax going from poor people to rich people. And I'm sorry, but I won't do it. There was one wind turbine built on land which I don't own, but it turned out that the mineral rights under it did belong to my family, and so I was due compensation. So I give that money away to charity every year. It's not very much. It's a tiny sum.
What's the state of shale in the United Kingdom right now?
Well, as of today, or the last couple of days, it's been announced that it will go ahead, but it'll take about a year to start, because one of the environmental regulations that's been insisted on is a 12-month baseline survey of the state of aquifers in the region. In energy terms and economically, Britain's shale position is very, very promising indeed. We've got a thing called the Boland Shale, which seems to have about 1,400 trillion cubic feet of gas in it, which is huge, bigger than the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, probably one of the biggest reserves yet found in the world of shale gas. Very rich, very deep, very thick. All the techniques developed in the United States should work here. But we are hedging it about with so much in the way of environmental measures about earth tremors, contamination of water, etc., that I fear that it will take a very, very long time for it to become economic. And we're insisting on the distribution of profits to local communities, which is a good idea, but to the point where it might, again, make it uneconomic. So the jury is still out on whether it's going to work economically, but the idea that Britain could produce as much energy from shale onshore in the UK as it has produced in the way of gas from its offshore reserves in the last 30 years is extremely plausible. And we've had a huge amount of gas out of the North Sea.
Let's close with your optimism. You wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. One could argue that that's a bias that you have to face in this area. I share that. I don't know if it's bias is the right word. A preconceived notion that human creativity is bigger than people often anticipate. In particular, how we will move around on this earth in 50 years, whether we're going to still use gasoline-powered cars and airplanes is, to me, a very open question. I think we're going to do all kinds of incredible things, and we'll find ways to do things more cheaply and adapt and find ways to use less energy. And I don't know what the future holds, but I remain somewhat optimistic. Do you share that?
Well, you say that I had a preconceived optimism, but it's only preconceived because of my experience over the last 30 or 40 years. And this is another of my arguments for being skeptical about dangerous climate change. I've witnessed the failure of apocalyptic predictions on so many different things in the last 3 decades, that it has very much influenced my view. I now approach apocalyptic predictions with great skepticism. So when I was young, the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, the oil was running out, nuclear winter was coming, the desert was advancing, the tropical rainforests were going to be totally destroyed, SARS and bird flu and swine flu, the sperm counts were going to collapse, acid rain, ozone layer. I've lived through all of these. I've covered several of them. And I've always come to the conclusion that the most alarming predictions are the ones that get the most coverage and are the ones that are most wrong. So I don't see why it should be any different in this case. And if I had believed everything that grown-ups told me in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I would expect this to be a very bleak world by now, where life expectancy had fallen, where pollution was terrible, where living standards had dropped, where famine was widespread. None of those things happened. In fact, there were extraordinary improvements in lifespan, child mortality, health, wealth, happiness, IQ, violence, all these things have improved. And I find it very implausible that it cannot happen again, because the mechanism by which we innovate, i.e. by exchanging ideas, got a heck of a lot easier in the last 10 or 15 years thanks to the internet. So I think it's very likely we will produce innovations that improve people's living standards during the current century. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have a disastrous world war, a descent into superstition, a collision with an asteroid. There are all sorts of things that could go wrong in this century. But I think there's every likelihood that the great-grandchildren who will face 1 or 2 degrees of warming in the next century will actually be pretty wealthy people. And funnily enough, that's what the IPCC says too. If you look at their charts of GDP per capita, they're between 3 and 16 times higher by 2100 than they are today.
My guest today has been Matt Ridley. Matt, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Russ, it's great to talk.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.